Hey, welcome back to How You Can Build Your Own Hydrofoil from Home video series, and in this video we're going to continue on shaping our fuselage. So we've just finished drilling the aluminium fuselage and we'll go through shaping it in this video. Now, while the camera was off, I actually decided to make a couple of design changes for the shape, but I'm going to show you the design changes that I've made and also how you can build the jig so that you can run this through the table saw to shape the fuselage for yourself. So we'll quickly go through that and then we'll actually cut the aluminium. So first off, I just wanted to say, when I was looking at this additional thickness, so the 1 inch by 1 inch fuselage that we've decided to go with, I decided that I wanted to slim some more out of it to reduce some of the weight that we didn't need. And so I've changed a couple of the dimensions here, and this will be on, I'll do the updated dimensions on your actual plan. But instead of 200 millimeters, I've gone to 300 millimeters. Instead of 92 millimeters, I've gone to 120 millimeters. Instead of 4, I've gone to 5. And instead of 12, I've gone to 12.5. So let me just quickly show you what that looks like on the aluminium. So first off, what you do is lay the aluminium out like it's looking the same as the plan. So we've got the top up here, and then we can basically draw out these dimensions. So I'm coming down 5 and across 120. So down 5 from the top, do a mark. You can see I've already drawn this line, but I'm just showing you how to mark it out. And then across 120, and then literally just draw a line, and all we're doing is just getting it ready to actually build the jig. And then what you can do is actually just, I like to just mark it so you know, okay, that's the waist. So that's what we're actually cutting off. Then at the back, we do exactly the same thing. So we've got 12.5 millimeters down, which is half, and 300 in. So 12.5, 300, and then again, just connect those dots. Like that. And that will be the shape that we're going to take. And you can see I think that that's a better shape for this amount of thickness. There's so much strength in this aluminium 1 inch by 1 inch that should take a bit of the weight out for us. The final cuts are actually off the tail. So right here we're going to slim out the tail to allow the water basically to produce less drag in the back. And I've made a change there too. We're going to 9 millimeters across the back there and up to 50 instead of 35. So if we look at this, what we need to do here is actually mark the center. So 12.5, and then come either side of that, 4.5, there and there, like that. And we can slim that out more at the end, but I'll show you why I've moved that to 9. Come up to 50, and come up to 50. And then you connect those two dots. So the idea here was to leave enough thickness on either side of the connection hole. So that's why I've made that a bit wider at the back and just slimmed it out a little more. So now that we've drawn the lines that we need, we basically use them in order to create the jig. So it's a really simple jig for the table saw. Before I talk about that, there are other ways that you could cut this. You could cut this with a bandsaw. You could even machine it down with a router. You know, if you're feeling really energetic, you could even do it with a hacksaw. But I choose to use the table saw for this. I find that that's definitely the easiest and the fastest, but you could definitely have a look at some other ways to cut aluminium, and you could choose any to actually do this. So to build the jig, I start by getting a parallel piece of plywood. So it's at 180 millimeters, and it's just a rectangle. And then I just use my eye to line up, if you have a look down here, line up that point and that point on the edges of the plywood. And then when we're cutting, we'll actually run the saw. The saw will be set to cut right down along the side of this ply. So this will be our reference, and the aluminium will literally be sitting over like that. So once you've lined that up, and you can just use your eye for this, it doesn't need to be absolutely perfect, because if it's 120 mils back, or or 124 mils back, or 118 mils back, it's not going to matter. This is just a number that I've picked just to make it look good and be sort of hydrodynamic. But if it's slightly out, it won't matter. So just do your best to line that up with your eye. And then I basically like to draw a line. So you can see I've drawn this line here. And then all you do is just screw on a block that's along that line that will serve as a backing board. And so I like to just screw that down. You'd be better off making this jig with some 3/4 plywood. And you could just fix it down like that. This is a bit too thin, and so I've actually decided to screw it from the other side. So once I've got it just held in position, I can use these other screws here. So we're going to do this we basically screw this one in position, and then we'll make that first cut, and then we'll unscrew this, move the jig, and make the second cut. But I'll show you. So now that that's fixed in, I'm just going to take this one out because it would have actually scratched the saw there poking through. Then what you can do, now we've got the angle, is you can slide it forward, and this will bring it in and out. So you just slide it until it's at the perfect position, and then we're going to put a block on the back as well. So any block just to hold it, can't go past there. You get a block. There you go. Any block that will hold it from getting kicked back. So we'll actually fasten this block down as well. And this is just all literally just to stop it moving around when it's on the saw. Because when you're cutting aluminium, it can kick. You definitely don't want it to grab or kick. There's more force than if you're cutting a piece of wood this size, of course. And so you don't want it to move around at all. So we start by just, I'll fix this at the back, setting these out, and then we'll actually clamp it in position as well. So I'm just going to pre-drill this on because these small pieces of fur have a tendency to split. Like I said, if you've got a thicker piece of ply, it would make more sense to use a thicker piece of ply so that your screws aren't sticking through like mine aren't here, and you don't actually have to screw it from the bottom. You can just screw it straight down and it's done. So next, there's two parts that I like to clamp this into position. So remember, of course, you've got the top side in for this first cut. We're cutting the front off. And by putting it in position here, I like to just use the through screws, so for the mast connection, and just literally screw it into the backing piece. That will just secure it in place really nicely, particularly for this one. I'm going to pre-drill it again. When you're pre-drilling it, you're better off to pre-drill at the bottom of the hole and not at the top of the hole, because if you are drilling at the top of the hole, when you tighten it, it will actually lift the fuselage. So drill at the bottom of the hole like that, and then the screw will pin it down and in. So just, there we go. And we'll just nip these up. Okay, so that is like really fixed in position now. That's not going to go anywhere, and it makes it a lot safer to push this through the saw. One last thing before we go and cut it. I've just got this small little jig. You can see it's just a piece of plywood with a thin piece of wood attached to it, and the wood is just slightly thicker than this. And so I just use this as a screw clamp essentially, where you can position this closer to where it's going to cut, and the idea is that it will force it down and won't let it chatter up and down, particularly for the next cut where the screws are further back, which you'll see in a moment. So I'm going to put that on anyway as an added safety precaution. I just find you could actually buy a clamp. There's toggle clamps that actually have a lever and they do exactly this purpose, but this is a simple workaround just to fasten it down. We've got it screwed in, of course, but this locks it down to make sure it doesn't lift up. Okay, let's go get the table saw. Okay, so we're ready to cut, and I've set the fence to the same width as the plywood, so the ply should just brush on the side of the blade there, which it's doing, and we're just going to literally push this straight through the saw. You don't need any lubricant or anything, you can just push it straight through. 1 inch is pretty thick, so you need to go slow and be careful and make sure it doesn't stick or kick or bind or anything. So of course use all your safety precautions, but yeah, we should be able to cut this straight through the saw. Okay, and that is the first cut complete. So now that we've made the first cut, we remove it from the jig. So loosen up from the jig, and the next cuts are going to be these two in the tail. Now these two lines are actually the same angle as this line, so we don't need to change this back of the jig. So that's why we'll do these ones next. And basically you'll just flip the fuselage around, unscrew the back block, because that will need to change, and then slide the fuselage into position again, eyeing up this line so that you're in exactly the right spot, and then we'll actually secure this and then cut it and then flip it over and cut the other side, and then both of those tail pieces will be identical. So I'm going to screw the back block on, and then again we'll be screwing this down to make sure that we're trying to fasten that down as much as possible. And if you have the perfect length screw, you can actually screw through these screw holes again and just into the base. The more the better. You will have seen in that last cut, it does sort of, there is a bit of force there sometimes when it shatters, so you definitely want to have this nice and secure. So I'll secure this one and we'll go and make the next cut. Before we make the second cut, just something I want to mention is that when you're cutting a small piece of aluminium, particularly in a wedge shape, through the saw, it can potentially fall down beside the blade and actually wedge in here, and so we don't want that to happen. So it's a good idea to either have, you can sometimes put an entire sheet down just with a very slim cut just for the blade to go through, but I'm just going to actually sit this thin stick just off the blade there. You could tape that in position just so that as we're cutting through, when the aluminium actually falls, it will just rest right on top of this instead of falling into the hole. So let's make this second cut. So now we've cut the front and also both of the small tail pieces. The next cut will be to slim out off the top of the tail, and in order to do this one we actually need to move the jig. So I've removed the blocks from the jig, and you'll basically mark out, because we've just cut this off, we just need to remark the center, so 12.5 millimeters down, so we can eye it up again like that. And then we're doing exactly the same as last time, so we basically eye up that point and this point on the plywood, and it's right about there like that. And then you can draw your line on the wood. I've already drawn my line, and you can see I've marked it with the back. So this was for the front jig, this is for the back jig, and basically, so I have my wood sitting there, level at the back there like that, and I know that I have the right angle. Then once you've screwed that on, just like last time, we'll have this in position and then screw a block on to support it at the back as well. Screw it into the wood, we put the clamp on, and we go and make this last cut. Okay, so now we're ready to make the last cut. This one is a longer cut, so again, make sure it's nice and secure. You want everything to be really locked into position. And I've also just brought a bit of oil. You don't need to necessarily lubricate this, but I just drizzle a line of oil along the line before I cut it in, just to give it something. But again, I've seen other people do things like push a candle into the running saw, and it will actually add wax to the blade, and then when you're cutting through, the blade's waxed. So there are other options you could Google if you want to try and lubricate it, but I just put a little bit of oil on top of the aluminium itself. So just run just a bead of aluminium, a bead of oil right there along where the cut will be. And then that will just feed in a little bit as we're cutting it. Okay, final cut. Okay, so that's all done, and I think that actually looks pretty good. You can see it's nice and slimmed out into the tail, so our main shaping is complete. Cutting that 1-inch aluminium is pretty intense. That's pretty heavy work for that saw, and so again, I just wanted to mention you could find other ways, like using a bandsaw or something that might feel, if you're not used to using a table saw, then you could find some other ways to cut it, but just make sure it's really secure, and you try and stay safe. Use your safety precautions, of course, when cutting anything this heavy. So the next step is actually just to clean this up with a belt sander, and what our goal is just to really smooth off these transitions, so we don't have any hard corners like this. We're going to actually sort of blend them around with the belt sander just attached to the bench here as well. But what I wanted to mention is we have these connection points. So obviously on the top, so all of this never needs to be sanded. We don't want to sand or touch any of that area. We don't want to sand or touch any of that area where the mast connects, and we don't want to sand or touch any of this area where the rear wing connects. So all we're trying to do at this stage is basically clean up the parts that we cut and just blend them back into make them smooth. So I've set up the belt sander with some 80 grit paper. If you don't have a belt sander, you could actually just file this with a normal file, but I like to use the belt sander. So we basically just, it can get a bit hot, of course, but we're just going to clean this up and make it look neat. So you can see it's starting to blend off there, and that sort of grain look is what we want. So we want to take out all of these sort of big marks and get it back to that smooth look. Okay, so that's all done, and now we're finished with the primary shaping of the fuselage. Just blended the corners in. It's pretty much all nice and smooth everywhere. All feels pretty good. And you know, there's some final sanding that we'll do in the later stages, but for now, we're finished with the shaping and we're going to move on to threading all of our holes. I'll see you in the next video.